It's my nerd world. Welcome to it. Positively Star Wars listener feedback for the week of February 7th, 2020, in case you didn't know what year it was. I am your host, Jon Justice, and this is the listener feedback show to last week's Positively Star Wars main show. I have a stack right here. I have a stack. You hear that? That's a stack. That's a stack of your listener comments because you left comments on YouTube. Thank you. You emailed me, TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. Thank you. And we've got a lot of topics and a lot of questions and a lot of subjects to cover this week. So, what do you say? Let's not waste any more time and get right to it.
Nothing will stand in our way.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
I will finish what you started.
Who are you?
I'm no one. There are stories about what happened.
It's true. All of it.
The Force. It's calling to you. Just let it in.
That's right, it is my nerd world. And I'm your host, Jon Justice. Positively Star Wars listener feedback this week. So glad you're with the show. First off, thank you so much for writing in and downloading the show and listening to the show. I really appreciate it more than you know. Now, for those that are just kind of catching up to speed, maybe you've been away from the show for a while, maybe it's your first time listening. So here's the deal. This is one of two weekly Star Wars shows. It was one show, Positively Star Wars. And within Positively Star Wars, we had news and my thoughts and commentary and then listener feedback. I don't like to pick and choose, for the most part, from the listener feedback that I get from the show. And as I mentioned last week, just as a bit of a recap, I found myself, because of the length of the big show, the main show, was getting so long, I found myself rushing through the listener feedback portion of the show. And I know for a lot of you, you really enjoy that part of the show, and I like doing that part of the show. So I decided to split up the shows. So, once a week, you'll get a Positively Star Wars listener feedback audio-only version, podcast-only version of the show. And then, over the weekend, you'll get the regular full show, which will be my news and commentary portion of Positively Star Wars, hosted by me, and you'll get the podcast version, and then also the video version with video and photos up on YouTube as well. So, and I would just want to thank, we got a lot of great feedback with regard to splitting the shows up. So we'll be talking a little bit more about that. Before we get into your listener feedback this week, I do want to mention that if you want to support my nerd world, and this is going to directly relate to kind of the way that I'm dealing with the show right now, because I'm hoping to expand the show at some point in time. Hosting the Depeche Mode, the podcast that I do once a week because I'm a massive Depeche Mode fan. Somebody had mentioned, hey, what about bringing some Depeche Mode fans on the show on occasion to join you? And I really want to do that. It is something that I've done in past My Nerd World Star Wars episodes. The issue that I have right now is I have a full-time job. So my full-time job being a radio talk show host on Justice and Drew here on Twin Cities News Talk in Minneapolis on iHeartRadio. I got a full-time gig. And so I do this in my spare time on the weekends along with writing my science fiction space opera novels. So one day in the distant, maybe not so distant future, but in the future, one day in the future, I hope to expand my nerd world, and that's been my plan all along. It's difficult for me to get guests on the show because I don't really ever have a set time when I'm going to have time to do the show. I just know that at some time between Wednesday and Saturday, I'm going to be recording the episodes. So that's why I rely on your listener feedback and treat that as you coming on to the show. And that's why I feel that it's appropriate for me to take time to read your comments, because a lot of you write in great detail and then respond to them. Hopefully sometime in the future, I'll be able to bring more guests back on the show again, maybe even invite some of you that write in to join me on the show. But if you want to help support the show, as I've mentioned before, don't have a Patreon. I don't have any intention of doing that anytime soon. just because I like to provide the show free, just like I do the radio show. So if you want to support the show, I'm sure you've heard me say it, but I'm going to say it again, and I'll say it at the end of the show. If you want to support the show, then I hope that you'll take a moment and go and pick up a copy of my science fiction space opera novels, EMBARK. I will say this weekend I do have another special running. Right now you can get the ebook for EMBARK Book 1 for just 99 cents, and you can get the ebook for Treasure in Darkness Book 2 for $2.99 ahead of the release in the next 2 months of Book 3, The Vanishing War. And as I've mentioned, if you purchase the ebook for less than $1, you can get a huge discount on the audiobook for either Book 1 or EMBARK Book 2, Treasure in Darkness. So for this weekend, it's a great opportunity to help support the show. If you've already purchased your copy, then I would just ask that maybe you go and get an ebook copy for a friend. You can click on the link right there at Amazon.com, and you can gift an ebook to a friend. And if you want to get the audiobook, use that gift to get a massive discount on the audiobook produced and narrated by me. So I'll promote the book again at the end of the show, like I always do, but I just wanted to take a moment and mention that if you got time, maybe while you're listening to this on your smartphone and you're near a computer, go to Amazon.com and search for Jon, Jon Justice, and EMBARK, and you can pick yourself up a copy of either of my books ahead of the third book and the conclusion of the opening trilogy for EMBARK. And I've got some really amazing plans for future stories in the EMBARK series. So this is a great opportunity for you to get caught up with the science fiction space opera adventures written by me. Amazon.com, look for Jon Justice, Jon, and EMBARK.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
All right, and let's just start off up front and just say you're all friends of the show. And I appreciate that. I have a... This is attached to the radio show that I do Monday through Friday on Twin Cities News Talk, Justice and Drew. But we have a label for listeners of the show. You have friends of the show. Friends of the show are people that listen to the show and actually like you and what you have to say. Doesn't mean you always have to agree. What fun is that? But a friend of the show is somebody who genuinely enjoys the show and listens because they like you. A fan of the show are people that listen to the show but then don't like you. Now, that's a lot more relevant in the talk radio world of news talk, right? The fan of the show, people that listen, but they're listening because they kind of hate listening, right? So those are fans of the show. You all are friends of the show. There's been a few fans of the My Nerd World show, but I don't like to give them too much attention. All right, so let's start off with Dale Erdman. He writes this. John, I wanted to send this email for a couple of reasons. First, I have to say that I love the new breakup of the show. Thank you, Dale. With the listener feedback being all one show and the news and your thoughts in another. I'm finding myself doing this a lot lately, but I agree with you. I was starting to feel your rushed nature to the show. Kind of almost felt like the way that The Rise of Skywalker felt the first time you watched it. So please keep it this way. I really like it. Also, would love to make a small suggestion once the sequel trilogy has reached its conclusion. Maybe a new intro to the show and something added, different sounders from the entire saga. Lastly, will you please add me to your mailing list? Thanks always for the great set of shows and a place for Star Wars fans to come and have a civil discussion. May the Force be with you. This is the way. And I have to apologize there. So I got these confused. So let me back up. Dale Erdman wrote, I like this Star Wars This Week plus listener feedback. The email that I just read came from Patrick Stoll. So my apologies. So Dale, thank you. I'm glad you like the new format. Patrick, my apologies. Thank you for also liking the new format and for adding your suggestions as well. I've been kicking around the idea of a new sounder. It's a little tough because I like to keep things somewhat consistent, and I will be planning on adding some more effects to the show. I've run into a couple of issues with this, and it's really been a problem with my Depeche Mode podcast, because even if I put even the slightest bit of music from Depeche Mode in the podcast, I get dinged for copyright. They don't take the video down, but I can't monetize on it, which sucks. So I've run into this problem on a couple of occasions with the Positively Star Wars show, but I haven't in a while. So that's why I've been a little reluctant to add particular elements into the show, but I'll definitely take that under consideration. And again, Dale and Patrick, my apologies that I got your emails mixed up there. So I hope I fixed that, and I won't do that again. I'm sorry. I apologize. Please keep listening. All right, let's go to Edwin. When will the third book be available on audio? Talking about EMBARK. Can you please add me to your mailing list? Thanks, Edwin. Yeah, Edwin's a great is a great listener, great supporter of the show. Actually did a couple the Download show on YouTube. Edwin was kind enough to do a couple of reviews of EMBARK, and so he was asking when the audiobook will be available. The audiobook will be available for The Vanishing War Book 3 around the same time in the next couple of months that the actual book is available. The audiobook takes it takes a lot of work to get the audiobook done. And I can't start recording the audiobook until I at least get the next edit, which is the editorial edit on the book, finished. So because of that, everything kind of gets pushed back a little bit. But I just finished up my edit of the book. It's turned out fantastic. I can't wait to get it out there. I'm really, really excited for this book, for this story. I've been excited about all the stories, right? I mean, I wrote them, why wouldn't I be? But there's just something about the way the book 3 has turned out that really, really has me excited. So I'm hoping, so we're February, March, April. I'm looking at April now. I kind of have to keep pushing the date back, but I'm looking at probably late April. I should have all versions out, just like the other books of the ebook, the paperback, and the audiobook. All right. Moving on. Claire Q says this: thank you so much for your positive words about Rey. I've been re-watching the sequel trilogy, and I totally agree with everything you said about her. She gets so much hate that she doesn't deserve. I certainly don't think everyone has to love her, but much of the criticism that gets thrown at her is unfair. Rey and Kylo Ren are two of my favorite characters in Star Wars, and I'm grateful to these films for giving that to me. Thank you so much, Claire, and let me take a little moment and talk a little bit about that. I haven't mentioned this in a while. I mentioned it on many, many podcasts ago. I mean, this is probably around the Force Awakens period. But as I've said, I saw A New Hope in theaters when I was 5 years old, so I grew up on the original trilogy. And my fandom of Star Wars was really different than a lot of other individuals. It wasn't necessarily a circumstance where I zeroed in and related to one particular character in the original trilogy. I just really loved all of it. I mean, I'd be really hard-pressed to even say what my favorite character is of the original trilogy. It's a lot like the movies. It kind of ebbs and flows and switches, and that's why I have a difficult time sort of ranking the movies, because I love them all for different reasons. And I know for a lot of individuals, especially a lot of guys my age, that was a big problem that they had with The Last Jedi, was the way that Luke Skywalker was treated. And as a matter of fact, I was listening to another show that I really, really enjoy, another Star Wars show, and the host of the show and the guest went on this little tiny deviation and tangent about The Last Jedi, and both of them were criticizing The Last Jedi for their portrayal of Luke. Now, I don't want to go there, because I don't agree, right? They didn't like, and I know a lot of people didn't like the way that Luke was treated in The Last Jedi. Didn't like the fact that he'd become a hermit, that he had, like they had said, that he became a coward, okay? I don't see it that way, and certainly not at the end of The Last Jedi, when Luke makes that triumphant return in that amazing Jedi move, by force projecting himself from Octo to Crate, right? And my buddy Zach over at Knights of Vader, which, by the way, I got to double back to that in just a moment. But my buddy Zach over at Knights of Vader has said often that he thinks a lot of people that don't like The Last Jedi never watched the movie to the end. And I understand what he's saying. He's being sarcastic, and generalizing. I do think a lot of people that don't like The Last Jedi, I think many of them didn't go back and watch it again after the first time. They were just that turned off. And I can understand that, because I know a lot of people that didn't like it the first time, but on rewatches ended up enjoying it even more. All right, so what does this have to do with Rey? This is what it has to do with Rey. Like a lot of people related to Luke Skywalker and really liked that character, Rey, because of the rise of Skywalker, has really become my favorite Star Wars character. what J.J. Abrams did in building off of, and I give Rian Johnson a ton of credit for this, because I think Rian Johnson did such a service to J.J. Abrams with what he did with Rey and Kylo Ren in The Last Jedi to get them where they got in The Rise of Skywalker, because both those characters in that movie that's my favorite version of the portrayal of those characters is in The Rise of Skywalker. And what J.J. Abrams did with Rey in The Rise of Skywalker has made her my favorite character. She is so dynamic in that movie. There are moments of joy, there are moments of sarcasm, there are moments of frustration, there are moments of anger, there are moments of pain. I mean, her emotions just run the complete range of emotions in The Rise of Skywalker. And there are so many just tiny, tiny moments with Rey in that movie that I really, really adore. And I just love what J.J. Abrams did with her character. And I'm thinking that on the main show this weekend of Positively Star Wars, I'm going to spend a little bit more time on that, because there are so many just individual key moments that Daisy Ridley just acts her butt off in The Rise of Skywalker that makes that movie so, for me, infinitely rewatchable. I've seen it 11 times now. I'm going for 12, hopefully on Monday. But there are just so many moments in that movie. There's no point of that movie that I want to go to the bathroom. And so much of that has to do with Rey. From the get-go of her floating to the way she spins down and goes, ugh, when she's frustrated, when she can't reach out to the Jedi that came before her. Her intensity when she's in the Force pull fight with that First Order trooper. The pain that she exudes when she thinks that she, spoiler alert, killed Chewbacca. That moment of compassion to the serpent underneath the ground on Pisana and looking at BB-8 and saying, you would have done the same thing. That moment of pure joy when she's got just this closed-mouth smile on her face, meeting that little alien girl at the beginning of when they arrived on Pisana. I mean, the list just goes on. And again, sort of all culminating in that moment where Ben Solo brings her back to life and just this look of pure joy because she finally sees Ben. And of course, just the leaning in and planning that kiss and then the agony of him passing away. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time on that on the Positively Star Wars show this week because it's still in the theaters. I want to spend some more time with that movie, and then I'll explain at the end of the show, because I received something today that should be in listener feedback, but actually the individual that emailed me is setting up the weekend show perfectly, and so we'll talk about that a little bit later on. All right, Geek Furious writes this: I've seen The Rise of Skywalker 15 times. He got me beat. Zach thought I had the record from over at Knights of Vader. No, Geek Furious beat me at 15. Oh, and by the way, before I forget, and I think I may have mentioned this last week, but I'll mention it again. If you want to listen to some really good commentary surrounding the Colin Trevorrow Duel of Fates script, the past 2 episodes of Knights of Vader are a must listen to. For those that know, I didn't cover it at length on the show. I really just didn't want to. I like to look forward. I like listening to the commentary, and I shared some thoughts on last week's show, but Zach, and then Zenger is on this week's show with Zach, and he had a guest last week's show, but they spent 2 weeks talking about the Duel of Fates script, and it really is some fantastic commentary, so definitely go and check that out, Knights of Vader, the Knights of Vader podcast. All right, back to Geek Furious. It's still my least favorite of the new movies, but I'm mostly fine with what was delivered. See, I dig that. I mean, that's the thing about Star Wars, right? It's kind of like pizza. I mean, pizza's pizza, you know? I mean, even bad pizza is still pizza. It's still better than most other food. I'd rather have pizza at Thanksgiving than anything else. All right. My biggest issues come from the movie feeling like it needed a good 20 more minutes to flesh out some things. And that opening with Kylo and then cutting to Poe and Finn and then cutting to Rey just felt narratively off. Not to mention, many of those early Leia scenes just don't work for me. Now, Geek Furious is another comment, and I'll get to that in a moment. Let me address that really quick. This comes back to that, art and movies and entertainment being subjective. And And I understand the criticism there, but like I've said, it doesn't bother me anymore. I like the pacing of the start of the film now. We kind of just were off and running, and we get into it. I just got out of seeing Birds of Prey, which I actually really enjoyed. That movie was a lot of fun. It kind of took everything that Suicide Squad did good, which wasn't a lot, but it did everything the Suicide Squad did good, and then built a good story around it, and expanded it, and did it better. But the beginning of Birds of Prey has this very sort of prologue feel, where we kind of spin through a lot of different stuff to until we get into the meat of the story. It's actually paced very similarly. And I understand the desire to want to flesh a few things out, but for me, again, seeing it 11 times and knowing how infinitely rewatchable it is in its current form, I'm kind of okay with that. I don't really need it to be any longer. I'd of course take an extended cut, but I'm good with how it is. The only thing that I would want any different, and I've mentioned this before, and I'm going to talk about it on the main show, is just that end space battle. I would have liked a little bit more of some linear storytelling and some smaller stories within the space battle at the end, more akin to what we got in Rogue One most recently, or going back to Return of the Jedi at the end, where you had the action taking place on Endor, but then you had the space battle. But the space battle had just a little bit more follow-through, a little bit more tracking of individual dogfights. The battle scenes, the vehicle battle scenes over Exegol are great. The shots are great, but it's like each cut is just like 3 seconds too quick. Like we need 3 or 4 more seconds on a particular X-Wing or TIE dagger. That's the only thing that I would have liked a little bit more of. But again, taking all the movies in total, I'm okay with it the way that it is, because I can always go back to, say, A New Hope and watch the Death Star battle. Which, by the way, watched A New Hope this week. That Death Star battle is still hands down the best space battle ever put to film, in my opinion. The way that George Lucas used existing World War II dogfighting footage, and it wasn't just World War II, but he used existing dogfighting footage as a placeholder and had the visual effects artists, especially with the special edition, go and craft those shots based off of what George Lucas cut, makes for an amazing, that space battle. It's so straightforward, so easy to follow, so exciting. From a vehicle file like I am, that it doesn't get any better than A New Hope and the battle over the Death Star. All right, Geek Furious continues, going back to the main show last week, and says, ignore every fan in the fandom. I'm sorry, ignore every fan in every fandom. Because the core of last week's show was my laying out why I believe that Disney and Lucasfilm, for the future of Star Wars, needs to ignore the fans and leave the content creators and the storytellers to be as authentic and as genuine as possible, to put the vision that they want to on screen and not try to go and please everybody. He says, ignore every fan in the fandom because they are more likely to represent the loudest minority of angry people than anything. Focus on telling interesting stories. TLJ may be controversial, but it will still be a great movie in 20 years. Focus on making interesting movies from interesting storytellers and less on checking off a list of things that fans want. Thank you, Geek Furious. I appreciate the comments. Let's see. Let's go here. I am still seeing so many YouTube comments of people calling Rey a Mary Sue, even though there is clear evidence that she isn't, and it really makes me angry. What are your thoughts on the matter? And my apologies, I cut and pasted this, and I didn't write down who sent me that comment. So my apologies. Feel free to email me and say, hey, that was me, and I'll give you credit on next week's show. What are your thoughts on her being Mary Sue? No, absolutely not a Mary Sue, especially now that we know she's a Palpatine. Spoiler alert. And I never felt that way. But I don't look at the movies that way. I'm probably the wrong person to ask. I mentioned before I'm kind of a Star Wars apologist. I can be objective and say that doesn't really work, but I also am not going to be like, I'm not going to not enjoy the movie because of that, right? I mentioned before, I think The Last Jedi is a masterpiece. But I also think that one of the greatest saber battles in all the movies is the Rey and Kylo Ren squaring off against the Praetorian Guards, and even I could admit there are some squirrely moments in that fight scene where the stunt guys are hanging a little bit too long, and you can tell that they're actually setting up to be attacked. Or the amazing final moment when Rey takes out that Praetorian Guard and then throws the Legacy Saber to Kylo Ren. We just ignore the fact that he had another weapon in his left hand, and his left hand is free in the middle of that. I don't care, right? So, again, I'm kind of the wrong person to ask, even though I can admit that there are inconsistencies. Why people say that, I don't know. That's just people have their opinion, and oftentimes I just say, hey, let them have their opinion. All right, next we move to Brian Martin. Now, Brian Martin has written a lot, and I felt compelled to share what Brian Martin has written. So here we go. Why do people think that Rey should have had training in order to have known how to do whatever Force ability she did? So maybe Brian was the one who made that first comment, because this seems tied to that. Don't they know that you don't need Force training to use the Force, but you need a training to become a Jedi? Is there really more to using the Force than just believing in it? If not, then how come Han didn't use the Force in TFA, since he finally accepted it was real by then? My understanding of it, maybe they'll expand on this further, and at least certainly what Rian Johnson put forward, which we know is canon, and this idea that anybody can use the Force, I look at it from the standpoint of you have to be willing to go and really tap into it and focus. And I think there are some the way that my headcanon on the Force works is that there's some people who are just way better at using the Force and more skilled than other people. Now, George used midichlorians to go and sort of substantiate that, and that's been kind of pitched off. And we know that looking for Force-sensitive children, has been a storyline, especially like in the Clone Wars. But my thought is it's like a skill. Not everybody has the Force in them, but not everybody is able to tap into it and utilize that particular talent of the Force. And some people are just way better at using it than other people. So with Luke, he's not using the Force, right? You've cut yourself off from the Force. I didn't see you. When Rey finally taps into it in the first training lesson in The Last Jedi, she says, you've closed yourself off for the Force. So I think for individuals who aren't Force sensitive, it's a matter of, well, they're just not engaged with it, and they're not training for it, and they don't care, so they're just sort of living their lives. One complaint I've often heard, Brian goes on to say, is that the sequel trilogy is the lack of world building in it. Context given as to where things are politically. What happened in between Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens to get us to this state? Why are the First Order and the Resistance even fighting? What makes the Resistance and the First Order any different from the Rebels and Empire? Why does the First Order want to destroy the Jedi Order? Okay. Now, I'm not sure if Brian's complaining here, asking the question, or if he's being rhetorical, but I'm going to go ahead and just answer it in kind. This falls into the category of what we ended up getting in the prequels. Okay. There was something special about the original trilogy because we went into it, we just accepted that this was the way things were. And because those movies came out at a time when not everybody had the ability to throw up every random thought in their head that's swirling around up on an app called Twitter, or put up a video and put up a title to get a bunch of clicks. When the original trilogy came out, it had the benefit of the conversation and commentary that happened when those movies came out happened amongst friends or in reviews or Siskel and Ebert on TV. Okay? So we just kind of accepted that that's the way things were. We didn't really ask. Right? Nobody really cared where the Emperor had been. Where did he come from? Okay, so there's this guy that Vader is sort of adhering to when we see him in The Empire Strikes Back, and okay, now we see this crusty old Force dark side user, Darth Sidious Palpatine in Return of the Jedi, but we don't really know where he's been or where he came from or what his ultimate plan was, and we didn't care, right? So what does George do? George goes back and does the prequels and actually does a lot of explaining, and then what happens? Well, people start complaining. Okay, so to what you were saying. That's the kind of stuff that, and again, I'll just speak for me personally, that's the kind of stuff they can fill in with ancillary material. I don't need that spelled out for me in the movies. what happened in between in the First Order. I don't know. And maybe you don't agree, and maybe this is Pollyanna-ish of me, but I just kind of accepted and sort of filled in the gaps, on my own. And, some of the stuff we got from Resistance helps with that when it comes to things like, where are things politically? If you read Bloodline, that's going to give you some background. What happened between Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens? Again, some of that ancillary material. I'm glad that stuff isn't necessarily in the sequel trilogy in the movies, because I think the movies would end up getting bogged down with that type of exposition. And it's something that I've heard people talk about with my first EMBARK book, by example. There's a lot of exposition at the beginning of that book because I personally felt that I needed to establish what the future was like for Earth, some 100, 200 years in the future, and I needed to make sure that I established exactly how things were and kind of made a baseline. In retrospect, I actually think I could probably go back and lose a lot of that exposition, because I think that maybe I, as a first-time author, didn't give enough credit to the reader to sort of go along for the ride. Now, there are some things that I included in the book that I've had people come and say, well, I would have liked a further explanation on that. And there were explanations, but it wasn't in great detail. All of this spins back around to, you can't make everybody happy. And I think these content creators know that, and especially with Star Wars has always been storytelling on the big screen that you had to kind of just accept this is the way things are. And I actually really appreciate what J.J. Abrams did in The Rise of Skywalker, and while I'm with a lot of people, I'd like a little bit more background on how Palpatine came back, but at the same time, I'm also totally okay that they didn't do that because it's Star Wars. And Star Wars doesn't need to explain everything to me, right? The dark side is a pathway to abilities that some would consider to be unnatural, right? Okay, so, all right, that's enough for me. Palpatine said he died before, right? And he came back, and it's the dark side, and we get the dude from Lord of the Rings who's saying, cloning, dark side. All right, I'm good. Okay, moving on. Is it appropriate to call the sequel trilogy big-budget fan fiction since George Lucas didn't work on it? A lot of people under the assumption that it is. In fact, I saw someone write, we aren't getting the true canon, what the creator of this story had in mind. We're getting 6 parts of this 9-part story. It's an incomplete vision and incredibly sad that we won't ever get to know how the saga truly ended. Man, if that's how somebody wants to view Star Wars, I can't help them. That's not how I'm going to do it. It just isn't. George always had in mind of having the Star Wars films being treated like the James Bond films. He always had that in mind. That's why he had so many people write the extra expanded universe stuff. He's always been a part of that. So I understand people's frustrations that George wasn't directly a part of these particular stories, but, if that's what somebody wants to think and doesn't want to enjoy the experience, I can't. What am I supposed to say to that? And this whole idea of fan service drives me nuts. So just because I like something that happens in The Rise of Skywalker, is that suddenly fan service? I'm sure somebody will write to me, TalkShowNerd@gmail.com or YouTube, and tell me what their definition of fan service is. But that always just kind of drove me nuts. Okay, if it's fan service, it's fine. It's fan service. I love it if it's fan service. I don't really care. Right? I guess to me, fan service is more like something you see in Rogue One, where you see the 2 dudes on Jeddah that were in, Dr. Evazan and, and what was it, Walrus Man? I can't remember the dude's name now. I'm sorry. It's been a long day. But when the 2 dudes show up, and when they're walking through Jeddah City, and those dudes were in the cantina in A New Hope, and that to me is kind of fan service. But I don't care. I dig it. Moving on. One thing a lot of people criticize about the sequel trilogy is that the conflict is really just Rebels versus Empire all over again. They think it's uninspired. What are your thoughts about that? Do you agree? No, I don't agree. As a matter of fact, with the sequel trilogy, I think it's way less about that. I get more of a prequel vibe from the sequel trilogy than I do the original trilogy, because the original trilogy was definitely sort of the Empire versus the Rebels, and while that is an aspect of the sequel trilogy, now that it's done in total, to me, that all takes sort of a backdrop to the story between Rey and Kylo Ren, to be honest with you. Because even in The Force Awakens, the First Order was just beginning to make their moves. And I had always I had always been of the opinion after The Force Awakens that, yeah, we're trying to establish this big guy versus little guy conflict for the larger sort of B plot of the story. But we didn't really even get into that in The Force Awakens until they killed the Hosnian system. And even then, that was done really quickly. You didn't get that oppressive feel of the Empire sort of crushing the galaxy, right, with their iron fist. And that's what I like about The Rise of Skywalker, is that The Rise of Skywalker, to me, brings back that threat element that we had in the original trilogy of, well, if we don't stop him now and those Star Destroyers get loose, we're going to end up in the same situation we were back when the Empire ruled. I told someone, Brian goes on to say, who hated the idea of Palpatine returning, that there would always be new threats to the galaxy after Return of the Jedi. I even said that he might as well say that World War II made World War I irrelevant. He responded with this: you can have new threats without completely undoing everything that was accomplished in the original trilogy. The New Republic was destroyed halfway through The Force Awakens by a threat that is pretty much identical to the Empire. And look, in retrospect, just to stop really quick, in retrospect, well, yeah, because it turns out that Palpatine was still a part of the whole thing, so of course it's going to be reminiscent of the Empire. And who do we find out later? It was being controlled by the Emperor, who wasn't dead after all. Right. Remember what the Rebel Alliance was officially called? The Alliance to Restore the Republic. How about the Jedi? Episode 6 is called Return of the Jedi, and before the opening frames of 7, the Jedi are wiped out yet again. By the way, your World War analogy is not a good one. First of all, these are movies, not real life. Does anybody see the irony in the person who's pushing back on Brian Martin in his comment by saying that these are movies, not real life? But if you want to go with this, Clone Wars was World War I, Galactic War was World War II, the Disney trilogy is like World War III, where Hitler, who didn't die, leads the Fourth Reich, teaming with newly militarized Japan to conquer the world. Yeah! Yeah! What's wrong with that? I dig it. Maybe that guy wasn't complaining. Thank you for all the comments and the emails, Brian. I appreciate it. I hope you go pick up a copy of EMBARK. I hope you all do. It would make me so happy. All right. Miranda, big friend of the show, says this: I feel like this needs to be said more than ever. Balance is the key to everything. What we do, think, say, eat, feel, they all require awareness, and through awareness, this awareness we can grow. The other night, I was randomly binge-watching on Rise of Skywalker trailers and TV spots, and I gotta say, kind of made me smile because it made me want to look back on the good times, and it's only been less than 2 months. Amazing. Thank you, Miranda, as always. I did the same thing. It's fun to go back and watch those trailers again now that you've seen the whole movie. It gets me excited to go watch the movie again. All right, Star Wars In-Game says this: John, your nerd world is part of my nerd world. Thank you. Always love listening to your YouTube videos. I like the new format you are setting, and I hope it works well for your channel. Thank you very much, Star Wars In-Game. All right. Mr. Maz has got a lot to say. Let's get into it. On ignoring fan backlash. This is a sticky situation, writes Mr. Maz. More than ever, fans are engaged with the production of media on a level they never were before. True. Fans can track productions now in real time. Yep. The studios cater to this by offering up far too much info on the films they're making. Totally agree. And there is also scoop and leak culture that wraps fans' perception of how films should be made. When random people can talk and express their desires directly to a studio director, producer, actor with social media, it's breaking a boundary I don't think should be broken during the process of creating something as massive as a film. Mr. Maz, I agree. It creates an inflated sense of entitlement. Take the Sonic film, for example. On one hand, I think it's awesome the studio listened and changed the design for Sonic. But at the same time, what if the film still sucks? I don't think the film looks any better than it did before the redesign. It still looks visually flat and unfunny to me. A more game/comic accurate Sonic design suddenly doesn't change the content of the film itself. Say the film isn't bad and the fans like it. Make no mistake, I'll give it a chance. What then? That just gives fans a sense of power and entitlement that they shouldn't have and shouldn't feel. If studios cave to fan outrage every time, it can only lead to creatively compromised films and shows, etc. What's the point of hiring people to create your own visions if they're just going to be beholden to the fans? We're already seeing this kind of attitude in social media, memes and such, praising Sonic the movie for listening to the fans and disparaging other franchises and films for not listening to the fans. The entitlement is already out there and prevalent. Goes on to say, Rogue One exists to literally fix a plot contrivance fans have joked about for decades. Fans, OMG, this is perfect Star Wars. The Rise of Skywalker tells its own story, wraps up the sequel trilogy, and wraps up the entire 9-film saga. OMG, it's just fan service, wah. Oh, it's so true. Yeah. And look, Mr. Maz makes a lot of great points, and I agree with a lot of it. I think these are all very individual circumstances, though, obviously. I think that when it comes to something like Sonic, for example, how in the world does the studio not go and make the Sonic the Hedgehog look like the video game version? That befuddles me. So, like in that circumstance, I can see the positive aspect, kind of what Mr. Maz was saying about that. Now, that being said, it does go too far if the studios actually go listening to the fans on every little thing, right? And I can mention any number of hashtag blah-bitty blah 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 campaigns that have been going on over the course of the past weeks, right? All right, moving on. Barmag also has a lot to say. Here we go. A little bit of fan service is okay, says Barmag, but ticking boxes like The Rise of Skywalker did is not. Things are getting spicy. It was like this movie was made to appeal and appease every corner of the fandom, which is impossible. Stick to the story you want to tell as a writer. Listen to the comments and reviews, but don't base your entire work around it. Also, Abrams and Terrio shouldn't have written what they wanted at all costs to the detriment of what was right for the characters, like Rey Palpatine or Rey Skywalker. Abrams and Terrio could have written Rey's parents as ex-Imperials who'd been stuck on Jakku and who had turned to alcohol after losing their faith and their ideals after the fall of Empire, and then growing up on Jakku would have been enough to explain any strength or anger that Rey might have had, or Rey being a Palpatine experiment who had escaped or had been saved by people who had then been killed. Also, Rey Skywalker, once again, it was something that Abrams and Terrio wanted, maybe even Disney or Lucasfilm, who knows, but once again, the story and the fans had evolved. Rey's self-adopted Skywalker is a weird ending because Rey never knew Anakin, barely knew Luke, and the other blood Skywalkers she was close to were Ben Solo and Leia Organa. That ending wasn't even fan service, it was writer's service. It was a corporate service so that Disney can use the name later on the benefits financially from the Skywalker characters that had created Rey and the ones who will come after her. The story should have evolved more organically around the characters. Instead, it evolved around what some fans wanted and what Abrams and Terrio wanted, exactly as if they were fans and not objective writers for this franchise. On top of that, the writers can't say that blood matters where the Knights of Ren are concerned. Kylo Ren is concerned, but not where Rey is concerned. Abrams can't retcon his own movie when the TFA, Lor San Tekka, told Kylo Ren you can't deny the truth that is your family. Basically, you can't turn your back on the light and ditch your family name, only for Rey to do exactly that in The Rise of Skywalker. Unless there is a double standard, and what is okay for Rey is not okay for Kylo Ren by writing her as a Palpatine, Disney doomed this character. Because if she enters politics with Poe, if she rebuilds the Jedi Order, the truth about her origins will resurface just like it did with Leia. And no, the galaxy won't have learned a lesson. The galaxy is a multitude of planets with greedy, corrupted politicians who won't hesitate to use her DNA to get rid of her and her order. If some have interest in the Jedi not being a part of the New Republic, it's like poetry, it rhymes, right? Okay. I can really get into a lot of this here because there's actually a lot of things that don't really align in my mind based on Barmag. I appreciate your comment. Don't misunderstand, but this Abrams and Terrio shouldn't have written what they wanted at all costs to the detriment of what was right for the characters. Let me point to this because it's kind of the crux of what you're saying here. Movies are what you make it. If you choose to inject new ideas into a story that already exists, you can create an argument. For example, the end battle could have moved the fleet from out of the unknown regions. A full space battle starting with a fight through the Red Nebula, thinning the Star Destroyer fleet to even the battle once they got clear of the Red Nebula they had to navigate through. Move the plot device of the radar, etc. Now, right, I can begin crafting all kinds of arguments because I've injected what I believe they should have done. Everyone's entitled to their opinion, but it's easier just to say, I didn't like the story choices, right? There's no way to know if another version is better. So for like everything that Barmag said, I disagree because I really like the choices that were made in the movie, and they made sense to me. So again, it's Barmag's opinion, but I see a lot of fans do this where they basically say, well, if they had gone this way, then all this stuff could have happened. Well, but that didn't happen, though. And I don't necessarily like to go in and at least I don't think that I do. And if I've done this in shows past and pointed out, but I don't necessarily like to go down the road of, well, if they had done this, then we could have had all this stuff. Well, I mean, you could do that to the nth degree, starting with every single frame of the movie and just build a brand new movie off of it. I much prefer to look at what we got and whether or not it worked. And I think that J.J. Abrams and Chris Terrio actually took a pretty big risk with The Rise of Skywalker, because I feel like that story is a bit of an homage to a lot of different movies that have come before it, be it Goonies or aspects of Independence Day. Heck, I even said there's a lot of stuff in there unintentionally that really aligns straight up with EMBARK Book 1. And it's probably a big reason why I enjoy the movie so much. But to circle all the way back around, the movies are what you make it. So, look, everyone's entitled to their opinion. And if that's how you feel, then that's how you feel. I disagree. And so for everybody that says that it shouldn't have been Rey Palpatine, or it shouldn't have been this, or Ben Solo should have lived, you know, there are people like me out there that can go, no, man, I like the fact that she's Rey Palpatine. I love the fact that it brought it full circle. I can relate to her story. I get it. I understand. And I think that the Ben Solo sacrifice was beautiful. Moving on. Jared Montauk says this: thank you for taking the time to read my email and put it up on last week's Positively Star Wars podcast. I wanted to try and clarify something you pointed out in reference to my last email, and I hope to get your thoughts in response. You're absolutely right. As fans and as movie viewers, we did not deserve anything. That was my fault for using that terminology when I did not intend to stress that specific word. That being said, what I was attempting to say with those two uses of the word is that I was not entirely satisfied with the explanations for Snoke and Palpatine. And regardless of rumors and clickbait articles or whatever it is out there, it seems to stand to reason that there were likely and potentially more definitive answers with scenes that were ultimately cut from the movie. Does that mean fans deserve to see them? No, absolutely not, as you stressed on your show. But my point is that however this movie was made, fine-tuned and tinkered with, the questions that fans thought they wanted, Snoke and Palpatine and even Rey, were still open-ended mystery box type answers. I'm fine with Rey being a Palpatine, but why is she a Palpatine, and what are the consequences of that? I'm fine with Palpatine being an overarching villain, but how has he been pulling the strings since the very beginning? I'm even fine with Palpatine making Snoke, but why and for what purpose did he make Snoke? Maybe these are just pressing questions that I'm overly drawn to, but the mere fact that I am raising them makes me believe that there are scenes that explain them, because Abrams and the rest of the writers and the filmmakers would have had to think through these questions as well, wouldn't they? Again, you're right, we don't deserve answers, but in terms of lore in the sequel trilogy has already created, aren't you just a little bit curious and bothered why those kinds of scenes were cut out of the film? I would love to know your thoughts. So I'm going to refer back to sort of the commentary that I did before about how I approach these movies and how these movies often leave a lot of stuff that we have to kind of fill in the back of our minds, right? We just accepted that X-Wing fighters can float off the ground and then fly off into space. We just accepted for the longest time that it just looked badass that the X-Wings had X-Wings that the X-Foils folded out when they went to attack. Why? Because it looked cool. Well, you found out later on that X-Wings end up heating up, and so those wings need to separate to allow the heat aspect from the engines to come, to dissipate, right? Which makes a little bit sense because they're flying in space, in the cold vacuum of space, it's freezing, and I don't know how many degrees below zero, so it wouldn't really matter, but it's Star Wars, so who cares? A couple more comments. So for one, sure, would I like to know more about Snoke's purpose? Would I like to know more about how Palpatine ended up surviving being yeeted down the Star Destroyer shaft? Yeah. Am I cool if I don't get it? Yeah, I'm fine. I'm good. If I get it someday, I'm fine. I want to mention something else, too. Don't believe everything you read out there. I know that's an understatement, but there was some Yahoo that showed up on a podcast. I think it was like Barstool Sports or something. And he was claiming to be an actor, one of the Knights of Ren, and said that there was an alternate ending to The Rise of Skywalker where Rey actually died and Ben Solo was the one who lived, and he ended up taking the Skywalker name. And then Lucasfilm came out and said, here are all the actors' names that played the Knights of Ren. That dude's a big old liar. So we know there was other stuff shot for the movie. We know there was stuff shifted around. But we really don't have a great gauge beyond the stuff that's been leaked on what was really shot and what wasn't really shot. And again, that all just dovetails back to the conversation that I had about how the leaks, while I even read them, are so detrimental to the fandom. Thank you, Jared. I hope that answers a little bit of your question, and I hope you didn't take any of that like me coming at you, because I wasn't at all. We're all entitled to our opinions on here, and I totally get it, and I try to be as respectful. But like I said, for me personally, while those things are interesting to me, I just don't let it bother me. I just go along for the ride. All right, I got a couple more here. John Hiratsuka. Friend of the show, too, and big supporter of the EMBARK books, too, so I really appreciate that, John. Star Wars movies need to be seen on the big screen. Thank you, John. I agree with you. Game Station 3. Did Palpatine's return in The Rise of Skywalker invalidate the Chosen One prophecy? Did Anakin fulfill it or not? No, it didn't invalidate it. As a matter of fact, you can hear Anakin's voice saying, bring balance to the Force as I did. My understanding has always been that just because something got into balance, it can still get out of balance. And when you consider what Luke did for that particular arc, ending with Return of the Jedi, he brought balance to the Force for that time period. Right? Balance to the Force was brought. And then we went some 30 years and, oh, no. Stuff got unbalanced again. Darkness rises and the light to meet it. Okay. Irene Davis writes this. I like the show very much this week. Enjoyed your share of Rey. Feel the same. Much of what you say I totally agree with. I have switched off and only listened to Star Wars Coffee and AT-AT Chat. The rest have just totally lost the plot in what I believe in the unhealthiest of ways. I bid you good night from the UK, and I look forward to much more of your content, as I believe you are genuine. Thank you very much, Irene. That's probably one of the nicest things people can say to me. Yeah, boy, there are so many shows that I cannot listen to right now. Around the Galaxy, I've really, really been enjoying. Around the Galaxy and Talking Bay 94, both those guys do a fantastic job, as does the Knights of Vader. There's a couple of shows out there that I tried to go back and listen to, but I won't name them. But man, there's a smugness that certain shows have that I just can't get past. It's just a personal preference thing for me, but there's just this. It's that lack of the, in my opinion, aspect of it, right? And I think that's where the divisiveness comes in, when people are so forthright in their commentary. Like, I was listening to one show, and one of the hosts went off on this rant about The Rise of Skywalker was not the culmination of the 9 movies. It was just the culmination of these 3 movies. It was wrong for Disney to go and to market this as being the end of the saga because it wasn't attached and didn't do anything and wasn't connected. And the whole commentary lacked this sort of self-awareness of, that's your opinion. And as a listener, I just find that a turnoff. Because if I don't agree, then I just feel like you're adding me. But you're actually me. And I don't dig that. But thankfully, I do my own show. See, that way, if people know who I'm talking about, and then they go, why don't you just go do your own show? I can say I already do. One more. Claire Q is back. Thank you so much for the positive words about Rey. Oh, wait, did I already read that one? Oh, my gosh. I did. Hold on. Let me go back. Did I screw up? I cut and pasted all of these, and so that happens. I did. Yeah, I already read that one. That's the one that I started off the show with. Sorry, Claire Q. But I did have an extra point in here so I can wrap up the show on this, so this is relevant. It's funny because I wrote down the notes that I wrote. They don't make a whole lot of sense, and that happens a lot when I write my own notes to these. But it says, make me wish we had a Luke story, which we kind of did like The Rise of Skywalker. Now that we're thinking about it, we actually did in Return of the Jedi. It actually makes me appreciate the Return of the Jedi more. So the point that I was making on that, I'll go back to kind of, we'll kind of donut the show with a little bit of raid discussion, and I'm going to continue this discussion on the Positively Star Wars main show later on this weekend. But yeah, the Rey story that we got in The Rise of Skywalker does actually make me appreciate the Luke Skywalker story in Return of the Jedi more. And it was probably an age thing, being so young. I hadn't lived, I hadn't lived a bunch. You know, you go kind of 5, 6, 7, 8, so it's 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, like 13. So from like 5 until 13 years old is my Star Wars period. And so I hadn't done a lot of living at that point. So a character like Luke Skywalker isn't really going to resonate with me like it is guys that are maybe close to my age, but maybe like 10 years younger than me, right? Who maybe saw the movies later on when they were older. So Rey's arc in The Rise of Skywalker makes me appreciate Luke's story a little bit more and what he went through, because it is so similar, because JJ did kind of model at least the arc of Rey's character off of Luke's character in Return of the Jedi. And I've mentioned many times that Return of the Jedi is arguably my least favorite Star Wars movie, even though I love that movie. There's some aspects of that movie I think are great, and all the stuff with Luke and, you know, the Emperor and Vader and the space battle at the end's fantastic, but there's just some of the set pieces in the movie don't really do it for me. The Jabba's palace, you know, it's fun, but not my favorite. Endor, it's fun, but, you know, not my favorite. And there's a lot of redundancy in Return of the Jedi, which is also something we're going to talk about on the main show this week. And that is, it's interesting to me when I hear people compare The Force Awakens, justifiably so, how it echoes and is very redundant to the original trilogy. But rarely do you ever see anybody talk about how Return of the Jedi follows a lot of the same beats, including the opening shot to A New Hope and a Death Star at the end. So I never had a problem with that. It's just those particular set pieces just didn't, you know, the forest planet was like, well, it's a forest planet. It's a forest. So whatever. And so it's just interesting. It's interesting how nostalgia ends up painting a different picture in our minds and makes us sort of incapable to look at those particular films in the same way that we hyper-analyze and a lot of people criticize the sequel trilogy. I love the sequel trilogy. I think it's really unique. I think it's special. It could very well sort of be placed in my top favorite Star Wars movies for a lot of different reasons. But I love them all and I celebrate them all. They all complement each other so well. Okay, and now I'm getting into territory that I'm going to be getting into on the main show, so I'm going to stop here. That was a long listener feedback show, but I'm so glad that you wrote in. I hope that I was respectful to everybody, and I hope you'll continue writing in. TalkShowNerd@gmail.com, and leave a comment on YouTube as well. So, again, if you're newer to the show, I haven't played this in a while, but this is my sort of thrown together ad for my EMBARK space opera series. It's 1 minute long, so don't go anywhere. But for those that aren't familiar with my science fiction space opera stories, here's a bit of an advertisement about what they are all about.
My Nerd World.
For Earth, the end is near. Only a reluctant hero and the girl he loves have the power to save humanity's future. It's the not-so-distant future, and car culture is replaced by air and space flight, made possible by two of Earth's largest corporations. Flight mechanic Taft Guardia spends his free time racing through the skies with his 3 best friends and the girl he longs to be with, headstrong Keith Amaro. With the planet on the brink of an industrial apocalypse, a powerful and ruthless corporate madman, Sint Argum, moves to exploit the disaster with his covertly created military. When Taft, Keitha, and their friends uncover a shocking secret, Sint Argum will stop at nothing to find them. Time on Earth is running out, but with the help of a ragtag group of young pilots, they'll fight for humanity's future and survival among the stars.
My Nerd World.
So head on over to Amazon.com and again, support the show by picking up a copy of the ebook, the paperback, or the audiobook. And right now you can get the first book in ebook for just 99 cents. And that gets you a huge discount on the audiobook narrated by me. Paperback is available as well for both Book 1 and Treasure in Darkness. If you already got it, thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, please go and leave a positive review up on Amazon.com. If not, go and get it to a friend who's a sci-fi fan. Even if they're a Trekkie, right? Go get them a copy. Support the show. All right, that's it. I hope you have yourself a fantastic week. I might be taking next week off, so I just want to give that bit of a warning. I'll have a final decision on the Positively Star Wars show that will be out later this weekend. So be looking forward to that podcast and the video version available up on YouTube. I am going to do, Tony, this is for you. I'm doing some Mandalorian talk on Positively Star Wars this week, so I know some people have been asking for it. But I might be taking next week off from recording anything. It's Daytona 500 weekend. NASCAR weekend's kicking underway. I might be getting a new computer to kind of help with my studio, and I think I need to take a break and devote my time to kind of getting everything in order for a week. So, again, I'll tell you for sure whether or not you should expect either show next week, but I hope you enjoyed this one. Go to Amazon.com, pick up a copy of the book. We reached the hour. That wasn't my plan, but it kind of worked out. So have yourself a fantastic weekend and week. Thanks again so much for checking the show out, and I'll talk to you again real soon. Bye.
The Force will be with you, always.
My Nerd World.